My name is Alistair Mackenzie, and I'm a director of the Institute for Continuing History, or ICH. Also in this meeting is John Walsby, who's providing technical support here in Canberra. The Institute for Continuing History aims to illuminate large-scale acts of state-sponsored or communal violence and the contexts in which they occur. Today's discussion is about the military campaigns against the Rohingya minority in Rakhine province of Myanmar in 2016 and 2017. The second of these campaigns, in August 2017, was estimated by a UN mission to have cost up to 10,000 lives. Around 1 million Rohingya refugees remain in neighbouring Bangladesh to this day. For background on the Rohingya crisis and the Myanmar context, you may wish to consult some of the sources that are listed on the ICH website. But I'm pleased now to introduce our three distinguished panellists. Dr. Suwita Hani Randhawa is a senior lecturer in politics and international relations at the University of the West of England in Bristol, UK. She has specific expertise on the historical origins of international crimes and the politics of international criminal law. Suwita has a DPhil in international relations from the University of Oxford, a master's degree from the Australian National University, and 2 undergraduate degrees from the University of Pretoria. Presently leading a global security and human rights research cluster, Dr. Randhawa has published in a variety of journals on international criminal law, the criminology of genocide, and the Rohingya crisis. Welcome, Suwita.
Thank you so much.
Former Ambassador Nicholas Coppel was Australia's ambassador to Myanmar for 4 years, from January 2015 to December 2018. His other senior diplomatic postings for Australia included head of the Regional Assistance Mission to the Solomon Islands, Deputy High Commissioner to Papua New Guinea, and Deputy Ambassador to the Philippines. Nicholas is currently Adjunct Associate Professor at Monash University in Melbourne, and he's been a regular commentator in Australia on Myanmar affairs, especially since the military coup of February 2021. Nicholas, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Dr. Morten Pedersen is Senior Lecturer in International Politics at the University of New South Wales, Canberra, the Australian Defence Force Academy. And he's a former senior analyst for the International Crisis Group in Myanmar. Dr. Pedersen has published widely on Myanmar politics and human rights for more than 2 decades. And he's worked as a policy advisor for the UN, the World Bank, the European Commission, and the Australian government, among others. His current research focuses on international responses to the 2021 military coup in Myanmar and the resultant civil war. Thank you, Morten, and thank you all. May I start with you, Suwita? You wrote that the situation of the Rohingya in Myanmar before 2017 already amounted to what you called a textbook case of pre-genocide. How deep do you see the historical roots of the crisis? And especially for those of us not versed in human rights law, how far should accountability extend? How far beyond the direct perpetrators?
Thank you so much. Quite big questions here. I have to confess that I'm not an expert in, kind of Myanmar politics, and I obviously would defer to perhaps Morten and Nicholas here. I suppose in sort of answering your question about how deep do the roots go back in terms of the lead up to the genocide, I think many commentators and followers recognize that we could perhaps pin down the sort of origins really going back to the sort of end of colonialism, perhaps even before, when we're thinking about how the Myanmar state was being organized and the different ways in which the state was sort of instrumental in kind of reinforcing divisions that perhaps already existed within Myanmar society. And I think this is what makes genocide a very interesting crime, in that it does tap into a lot of existing cleavages within society, and it magnifies some of them in specific ways. And as most of us already know, with the case of the Rohingya, it is a case of kind of capitalizing on, sort of perceived differences of how this group is versus what the state in this case is trying to construct about its perceived view of what Myanmar society, the dominant sectors of that society are. So I suppose we could in fact trace it back. I'm not sure how useful that is sometimes, because we then get into bigger questions about legacies of colonialism, and where does the responsibility lie then in such historical instances. But perhaps to kind of bring it to the present now, in terms of the accountability issue that you raised, what I think is really fascinating about this case is that, and what we've not really seen in contemporary cases of international criminal justice, is just how many parallel accountability efforts are running in parallel. So I think many people are aware of the big cases internationally at the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, both of which were initiated in 2017. But alongside that, we have seen domestic cases being instituted from 2017 until recently, earlier this year in January, in jurisdictions which place an emphasis on the importance of universal jurisdiction. So here we have seen efforts to prosecute in not only in Argentina, but also in Turkey, in Indonesia. To a lesser extent, it's still sort of underway, the kind of looking into the way in which Indonesia might be able to start a universal jurisdiction case. But then most recently, like I mentioned earlier this year, in Germany. So I think for commentators of international criminal justice, the accountability for the Rohingya genocide, which many people seem to agree amounts to a genocide, is just how interesting, how there are so many parallel accountability efforts underway at the same time. And it's almost, some get more coverage than others in a way, which also speaks to kind of the broader discourse of accountability efforts as well. I might leave it there for now.
Thank you very much, Suwita. That's really helpful and lots of food for thought. I wonder whether Nicholas or Morten might have some comment in relation to that. Particularly, I suppose there is always the question about mechanisms for international justice and just how much impact they can have domestically. And I suppose it's very easy to adopt a measure of skepticism towards them, but on the other hand, it's a very hard ask to us to suggest that we should abandon them. What do you think, Nicholas?
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, I might just say I agree with the comments Suwita's made about, going back to historical explanations of what's happened. I mean, yes, certainly there are cleavages there in society before, but I think if we look too far back for historical explanations, we diminish the responsibility of those today. And I think those who have taken actions today, I mean, in 2016, 2017, and indeed continuing against the Rohingya, need to be held accountable for their actions. And it isn't a justification to look at some historical explanation for that, what in essence is a deep-seated prejudice. So accountability attaches to the individuals who are responsible for actions that have been taken. And I think we need to focus on those individuals. And that leads me to supporting these mechanisms through international legal mechanisms to hold people to account for their actions. I think looking too far back into history, I think in a way seeks to explain their behavior. And I don't think there is a valid justification for their behavior. So But that said, how effective are they? I think they're important for sending a message about the expectations that the international community has about what is acceptable behavior and what is not. Whether they will bring those individuals to account ultimately, I think is less clear. But that doesn't mean they are actions which are of no value whatsoever. I think they send clear signals about what we stand for, what we believe in, what is acceptable conduct, and seeking to hold people to those standards, to upholding of human rights, is always a very worthwhile endeavor, irrespective of whether the outcome ultimately is successful or not. I think the process is important. The international attention that it puts on those issues is also important. And so I think they are to be supported.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. I guess what I had in mind in referring to historical background was really wider social context, and therefore, and why sort of I moved on to accountability is, how far does accountability extend? You referred to direct perpetrators and so on. And that's something we can toss around perhaps. Morten, you've talked about a principled engagement with the generals as being really the only way forward, that if I'm not misquoting you, that we have to deal with Myanmar as it is. And I do understand what you mean by principled engagement, is that you don't throw away principles in talking to those who are seen to have facilitated human rights abuses. Could you explain that for us a little bit more about and how that might fit in with the sort of international justice mechanisms that Suwita and Nicholas have described?
Yes, I guess I should start by sort of stating a caveat, right? Because my writings about principled engagement goes a few years back, and they kind of assumes a certain level of normalcy of government. And that's something that we simply don't have today. I mean, since the coup, with everything that has happened since the coup, we now have the different sides, and there are many sides in the conflict in Myanmar, engaged in essentially an existential struggle for survival. And I think under those conditions, a lot of the sort of the talk about how we might engage with different actors to get them to act rationally is kind of mute, because that's simply not where they are at the moment. As I said, they are fighting for their survival. So I don't think there's much scope just at the present moment for this kind of principled engagement. But we can talk about it maybe a little bit as an idea, right? And maybe for something that was relevant in the past and may become relevant again in the future. The starting point for my own thinking about this is really concerned that the sort of the standard approaches, Western approaches in particular, to human rights abuses, including international justice mechanisms, but also broader issues around naming, shaming, sanctions, kind of the traditional human rights approaches, that they simply don't have any visible or significant impact in countries like Myanmar. And when it comes to international justice mechanisms, I fully agree with everything that Nicholas said, that there is certainly at a global level, there are strong reasons for highlighting the abuses, for pursuing accountability. My concern is that I see very little scope for international justice mechanisms actually having any positive impact for the Rohingya themselves, right? So for the victims. And there's kind of three elements to that, right? I mean, international justice, as I see it anyway, mechanisms are seen to kind of do two or three things. I mean, first of all, there is the issue of bringing justice to the victims, right? That, of course, is the starting point. That assumes that whether it's the ICC or the ICJ or whatever of these various avenues that are currently being pursued, that they actually lead to those responsible being held responsible in a more physical sense, right? Actually being grabbed and punished in some way. Now it's very hard to see much prospect for that happening in the case of Myanmar, right? So keeping in mind that a lot of Rohingya are calling for these things, I think that in itself is something we need to take seriously. So I won't kind of dismiss this, but I don't see much prospect of actually justice being meted out through this process. Another major concern, of course, is deterring future abuses, right? Accountability, not just for the past, but for the purpose of deterring future abuses. And I think, again, I don't see much prospect of that happening. I mean, the Myanmar military lives in that sense in their own world and have done for many years. They have very, not good reasons, but they have very strong reasons for doing a lot of what they do. And that the idea that we can kind of stop them from doing this by having some discussions in faraway courts overseas, you know, to my mind, there's not really much prospect of that. Maybe just adding one element to that, I am concerned, and this is a general debate, I'm not the only one who says this, but I am concerned that what we are doing is that we are, in a sense, motivating the military to do even more than they already were to hold on to power, right? Because once you're subject to international justice mechanisms, the only way to stay safe is to stay in power. Now, you can argue that they wanted to stay in power anyway, and it doesn't make any difference, but certainly there is a risk that you that you actually reduce the prospects for reform going forward, because the generals will first and foremost be concerned about protecting themselves. And the only way to do that, as I said, is to stay in power, right? So there's some potential perverse effects of this. So my discussions of principled engagement come out of a disillusion with the traditional approaches, right? But the key to principled engagement is that I believe, generally speaking, in Myanmar, on the Rohingya issue, but also many other issues and in other countries, the best work to promote human rights is done on the ground through engagement. A lot of this kind of distant stuff that we do, the human rights reports, the sanctions, and indeed the international justice mechanisms, tend to have very little impact on what happens on the ground. Now, engagement on the ground tend to not provide solutions, sort of ultimate solution to things, but there are lots of evidence to suggest that engagement on the ground can at least in smaller ways improve the situation, including for potential victims like the Rohingya, right? So I think I won't continue into that at this point. We can come back to it if you want, but the basic idea about principled engagement is, if you actually want to make a difference and not just be seen to, you know, do the right thing, you need to get on the ground. And getting on the ground, to get back to your original comment, invariably means engaging with all the significant players on the ground, including those who do the evil things, right? You have to sup with the devil in order to have an impact, is my fundamental perspective on this.
Nicholas and Suwita, do you have any comment? That's a very, very valuable and extensive comment. I'm just wondering if you have any response to what Morten said there.
If I could go, yeah, definitely. Yes. I think lots to say. In fact, I really liked the point you've mentioned about the limits of international criminal justice with respect to the victims themselves. And I think here there are, you know, huge debates around international criminal justice that sometimes get forgotten when we are kind of focused on the symbolism of what's happening at the moment. And that is that the sheer scale of these crimes. There are questions about whether punishment, you know, kind of having someone be imprisoned and having a life sentence, does that really kind of, is it really the most adequate response to such, you know, grave crimes? And, you know, there are these debates happening within international criminal justice, even though the entire project is based, as Morten said, on this idea of deterrence and punishment. But you know, it's sometimes difficult to kind of reconcile that imperative with the sense that, you know, to what extent will victims of genocide within the Rohingya community actually feel someone being put away in a jail in The Hague, is that really going to give them any sense of justice, right? So there are bigger questions here about what will justice mean for the Rohingya themselves. So related to that, I also like to point out that what I find interesting alongside all of this is that we don't hear much discussion about perhaps local forms of justice. A lot of the activism around bringing accountability efforts has centered on, as Morten put it, sort of Western approaches to human rights and justice. This is not to say that, you know, there could be alternative forms of justice. We know, for instance, that different countries, for example, in Rwanda, pursued local forms of justice through gacaca courts, for instance. We also know that there are different forms of justice, such as restorative justice, etc. And we don't hear so much about perhaps movement or debates going around about how there could be scope to animate these accountability efforts through a notion of justice that means something more to the Rohingya community themselves. And then finally, with Morten's point about this view of, you know, justice happening in a court far away in Europe, I think that's a really important one, because justice doesn't only need to be meted out, it needs to be seen, right? And perhaps two things to say in this regard. The ICC in particular is very cognizant of this. And in fact, very recently, there were petitions to the trial chamber to request a field office be opened up in the Cox's Bazar, mainly to facilitate the ability to gain more outreach with the communities and the refugees in the camp, but also to be able to bring the justice closer. Unfortunately, the ICC has ruled very recently that they don't see a reason for opening up this field office right now, given the early stages of the proceedings. So it's a bit disappointing in this regard, because this was a petition brought on behalf of Rohingya communities and sort of the activist groups around them. So I think it is an important point, because justice does need to be seen. And given the fact that, you know, there have been reports of internet being cut off in these refugee camps, there isn't much scope for these communities to hear about what's actually going on in The Hague, let alone see some televised, you know, live recordings of perhaps ongoing proceedings. But nevertheless, I do think that even if we were to be critical of you know, the kind of limits of international criminal justice, what it is doing right now, aside from what Nicholas mentioned about the symbolism and the message it sends out, is that in these different proceedings, what we have seen, and I think what is important, is that victims are being given a chance to provide their testimony. And we have seen this happening, although some of this is kind of confidential and secret. A lot of the cases, for example, in Argentina, alongside the ones in Germany and at the ICC, have involved actual testimony. So I suppose, you know, there are kind of views in sort of conflict studies saying that, you know, part of all these efforts to end conflicts and bring about justice is not simply the big symbol. It is also about us being able to hear the actual testimony, and that is important in terms of empowering victims. But I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much, Suwita. Thank you. Nicholas, do you have anything to add at this point?
Yes, I mean, I think I would share Morten's frustration with the efficacy of traditional forms of pressure on the regime in Myanmar. But I also have a frustration with attempts at engagement with the regime in Myanmar. We see the military regime has no appetite for negotiation. And the national unity government, when we're talking about the conflict in the coup in Myanmar, also has no appetite for engagement. And it seems to be also that the sentiment of many people within Myanmar is that there is no going back to a deal with Myanmar's military. They want the military out of government altogether. And so, I mean, I have a frustration also with engagement. And the UN special envoy, the ASEAN special envoy, these are attempts at principled engagement, and they have had a lot of difficulty in making any headway. But that is not to say that they shouldn't be trying. I think, the alternative to engagement is some ongoing war of attrition between the two countries. And the Rohingya get forgotten in all of this until there's some settlement within Myanmar politics more generally. And indeed, international attention has also shifted from the Rohingya to the conflict, the coup in Myanmar and the resistance to that coup. So in a sense, for the suffering Rohingya communities, there needs to be some settlement within Myanmar before there's going to be any progress on their cause. It shouldn't have to be held hostage to that, but I'm afraid I think that's the way it's likely to proceed. But also in terms of the Rohingya communities' eventual return to Myanmar, which I think is the only just solution, I can't see them wishing to return while the military remain in command of the country, and these are the individuals who are responsible for the barbarous actions. It just isn't safe for them to return at the moment. So, in a sense, an overthrow of the military government is a precondition for some solution to the situation which the Rohingya people find themselves in today. So that comes down to, yes, we need some engagement, but it's just not happening at the moment. And so there's a lot of frustration around that, I find.
Thank you, Nicholas. And thank you all for those contributions. It certainly doesn't get any easier for, do good external observers with the clear barriers to breakthroughs in the international justice system. And of course, as you mentioned, Nicholas, the Rohingya becoming forgotten, not only in the midst of the Myanmar crisis, but then the post-coup Myanmar sort of disappearing from view from time to time in the light of what's happening in Ukraine. So it's very difficult. But I was particularly taken by your point, Suwita, that these cases that are taking place in domestic courts and so on have the value of putting the testimony on the record, and really that's what our little institute is all about. Is it's about competing narratives and trying to bolster the narrative of those who've been subject to state violence rather than the perpetrators. One of the driving forces for this discussion taking place is the work that's been done recently by the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, which found evidence of systematic planning by military leaders in the removals of the Rohingya. I'm just wondering now, my sense from what you said, Suwita, is that it's important for this to go on. For the evidence to be being put on the table, irrespective of what happens domestically in Myanmar and what happens in the international justice system. Do you think, each of you, we've reached a point where, with the UN reports and what's happening in the courts, that we've practically got enough, and that we need to be thinking constantly about pressure on the generals, or is there a real role? How do you see the role of historical research on these mass clearances? Is it something that is as important as anything else in this process?
Well, yes, certainly, because a lot of this historical research is valuable in terms of getting evidence that will then be presented at these various justice accountability efforts. Certainly, but I think it's important to also note that there is a lot of evidence collecting happening at the moment. I was looking up, for example, at the work that the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar is doing. So this is a UN body set up by the Human Rights Council, and their mandate is specifically to go through the evidence that a former body, the fact-finding mission, had collated. And they are still in the process of collecting evidence, not just historically, but even as we're speaking now in contemporary times. And what they have said is that in their recent report is that so far they have over 20 million bits of evidence, and this ranges from testimony, media, social media reports, videos, artifacts. And they're not the only ones collecting this. There are obviously efforts within the ICC who are also getting evidence. But I suppose my point is that the evidence is not just historical, right? It is actually going on now. But what is very, I suppose, encouraging is that there's been a lot of sharing of this information. So these UN bodies are also mandated to hand over some of this evidence to the ICC, and they also share it with the parties of that ICJ case, so Myanmar and the Gambia. So I think there's a lot of evidence circulating. I think we don't know so much about that evidence because it is, of course, confidential. But certainly, to sort of answer your question directly, the importance of historical research, but I suppose more so collecting evidence, even contemporary ones, is just really critical for the success of these cases.
Thank you very much, Suwita. Morten, does a research endeavour, as Suwita and I've been describing, does that fit into your idea that the only fruitful approach is some sort of engagement domestically?
Well, I mean, one could certainly think of or imagine a situation in the future where principal engagement were to become meaningful again, where this kind of evidence could be used as part of a dialogue with relevant actors, right? So I have no problem at all. Indeed, I'm very much in favor of the processes that Suwita describes. I guess just to maybe reiterate with slightly different words, my concern is that there is a tendency in the international community to do the easy things, right? Collecting evidence is, comparatively speaking, easy. Imposing sanction, comparatively speaking, easy. It shows that we are doing something. It makes us feel good about ourselves. But if we actually want to make a difference, my argument is we need to get on the ground and do things that are much, much harder, right? So let's do all of that, the sanctions, the collection of evidence, but it cannot be at the expense of or as an excuse for not doing the much harder work, which to my mind happens on the ground. And it's hard in many ways. It's risky. It's hard in terms of personal reputations and so on, because when you do these types of engagement things, you tend to be criticized by people who see the world in black and white, who are, I might use the term, purists, who don't believe that we should be talking to the perpetrators of violence and so on, right? So anybody who engage in engagement are at significant sort of personal risk, certainly in reputational terms, but sometimes also in physical terms. And this, of course, is the same for any kind of peace mediator anywhere in the world, right? One of the most dangerous jobs in the world is to be a mediator in conflicts where the two sides, as Nicholas said earlier, have no interest in being mediated, right? I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Morten. Nicholas, do you have any reflections on that from your time as Australia's representative in Myanmar and your engagement with? Well, it was a different period. It was when Aung San Suu Kyi was state councillor and so on. Do you have any sense of how one might meaningfully engage with the generals, for instance?
Well, I have experience of it. I mean, I was there from 2015 to 2018, and I visited Rakhine and Rohingya communities prior to what was to happen in terms of the forced expulsion of 700,000 Rohingya or more, and all the other offences that were committed against them. I also visited the IDP camps for Rohingya communities who had been, pushed out of their homes. It was 2012, and they're still in camps, and they still are today. So there's still, in addition to the million or so who are in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, there are well over 100,000 Rohingya languishing in camps in Myanmar today. And this, I think, tells us something about the regime in Myanmar. I mean, they really have no interest in correcting their excesses. So even if when the rest of the world points out to them, their inhumane actions and the unjustness of the situation, they have had plenty of opportunity to try and improve the situation of these people, but they haven't. They haven't taken any chance whatsoever. So that also means that when ultimately at some point, if there is engagement with them, it's hard to accept that whatever commitment they make is a genuine one. I mean, I think they've really shown their true colours, and that is one of a complete disregard for the Rohingya people and an unwavering commitment to view that the Rohingya have no place in Myanmar, in the physical structure of Myanmar, and that they are people who should be outside of the country. But obviously, I mean, as the ambassador to Myanmar, I mean, I had instructions to make representations following the events in 2017, and I did that with a range of senior people in Myanmar, but including with the Commander-in-Chief, Min Aung Hlaing. And he agreed to receive me for a meeting. And at that meeting, I mean, it was a very formal event, which is not unusual in Myanmar, where I'm seated at the front with him. We both have microphones, even though we're right next to each other, and then two sides are arrayed side by side in this enormous meeting hall with very large chairs. And he knew why I had come to see him, and before I could say anything to him, he opened and spoke for almost an hour. Monologue. It wasn't a conversation. It wasn't a discussion. It wasn't an opportunity for me to have any advocacy, really. He was forcing me to listen to his view of what had happened and why it had happened and why the Rohingya do not belong in Myanmar. I mean, no remorse whatsoever, and no admission of disproportionate use of force, nothing whatsoever. I mean, then I had my turn to speak, but it was relatively brief compared to the serve I got from him. It also goes to show what we're up against in dealing with this man. I mean, he's not a person who's willing. I mean, Morten makes the point that they're impervious to international opinion and measures. True, but he's also deaf to anything that he might be hearing within his own group, and deaf to what he's certainly hearing from a foreign ambassador. He had no interest whatsoever in listening to my points of view, didn't accept any point I made. He saw simply the meeting as an opportunity to reiterate his view of the world and his justification for his actions. So, as I say, it's so long as he is in power, I fear that it's unlikely that there'll be any progress on the ground in terms of justice for the Rohingya, justice for the people of Myanmar more broadly.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. So I think it's fair to say that we're marking time and doing what we can in terms of evidence gathering, in terms of international justice processes, and in terms of any sort of limited domestic engagement we might have, which I gather is, well, am I right in saying it's practically nil, Morten, at the moment? I mean, we talked about principal engagement before, and you made the point that things have shifted since you wrote about that.
Well, I mean, my view would be that engagement at this point in time is not about mediation, because nobody's interested in being mediated. It's also not about persuading Min Aung Hlaing to do something different, because as we just heard, he is not listening. And even if he was listening, he's preoccupied with other more important things, survival being the primary one at this point in time. The argument for engagement at this point in time is learning. Right. It's only if we engage with, talk to, even just listen to, that we can learn more about what's going on, in a sense, behind the scenes. Right. So the purpose of engagement at this point in time, certainly with the military, would be primarily about learning. Now, there are a different set of stakeholders that we should be engaging with. And I think that we could, at this point in time, actually very usefully engage with. And broadly speaking, we are talking about the disparate elements of what most Burma watchers refer to as the resistance, right? So all the people who are now fighting the military. Now, we haven't talked so much about this, but I think it's common knowledge that there are a lot of people in Myanmar who basically view the Rohingya in the same terms as Min Aung Hlaing views them. And in fact, the military was briefly quite popular for their action against the Rohingya. Now, there is an opening now, because as part of this resistance against the military, there is a new kind of beginning. I think it's very embryonic. We shouldn't overstate it, but there is an opening for discussing with a variety of actors, including possibly people who may have an influence in government in the future, to move forward what we might, broadly speaking, think of as reconciliation between, the Rohingya and other groups in Myanmar society. And I think there's quite a lot of space at this point in time for that kind of engagement, right? Maybe just a final point in terms of the Rohingya, because yes, in many ways, we are kind of waiting now, because they are, at least from the perspective of most of the key actors in Myanmar, there are more important things going on right now, issues to do, as I've said several times, with survival, right? So there's not much space of making progress on smaller issues. And I use that term not in the sense that they're small, but smaller in the views of the relevant actors. It's hard to make progress on the Rohingya issue at this point in time. One thing that we could do, and I know this is a little bit idealistic, but I have said since day one that the 1 million Rohingyas, more or less, who sits just across the border in Bangladesh today, the chances that even the majority of those will ever be going back home are very, very small. So we need to look at those two other solutions for long-term refugees, which I believe are well known, right? One is reintegration into the society that they are currently in, so in Bangladesh. And the third is repatriation, or whatever the term is, to third countries, right? I think until we get to have a serious policy on helping the Rohingya, we simply cannot keep insisting that the only or even the best solution is for the majority of them to go home. It is very unlikely that that will ever happen. Of course, nobody should ever be forced to do anything. Nobody should be forced to move to a third country or to stay in Bangladesh if they don't want to. But those options should be on the table, because otherwise they will be sitting in those camps for, at least the foreseeable future, in my view. And I have a hard time taking Western protestations to be working to help the Rohingya seriously until we see a serious commitment to consider third country repatriation. They're simply, that has to be part of the solution. And if we're not willing to take them, we certainly can't be claiming that we're doing everything we can to help the Rohingya.
Thank you very much, Morten. That's, in a strange way, I find that a little bit encouraging, because it's not a completely, you did talk about a small opening, and that's better than nothing. Suwita, I wonder whether you have any comment on the sort of trajectory that Morten has indicated might be possible, particularly in relation to the Rohingya diaspora, and maybe you have some sort of legal sense of how things stand in terms of international law on that.
Sure, yes, very interesting points to pick up on, actually. Thank you, Morten. I liked what you said about the necessity of engaging with different stakeholders. And in this regard, I think maybe we haven't talked enough about, in our conversation here today, about the implications of the coup in 2021, because the result of that coup is demonstrating that there are different stakeholders, particularly at this point. A major one would be the coalition government in exile, right? And so maybe just to link that back with the justice efforts, there is some very interesting debates going on, because we tend to think that these justice legal things proceed without any kind of influence of broader politics. But of course, law and politics are very closely intertwined. And so, for example, at the proceedings before the ICJ, there is currently debate now about why isn't the ICJ actually engaging with the legitimate government that was voted in prior to the coup. The ICJ has unfortunately adopted a very very placated response, and it's sending all the correspondence to a formal address, which of course at the receiving end of that address, that postal box, is the military agents, right? So there are kind of deeper questions here about, even within the justice efforts, who should we really be engaging with? I know, for example, that the NGO group based in Thailand, Fortify Rights, has recently issued a report that suggests that the coalition government in exile should be, in fact, making representations to, I suppose, almost override Myanmar's position with regards to these international treaties that kind of surround international justice. So, for example, there are calls for the government in exile to sign on to the Rome Statute and to accept jurisdiction of the court to perhaps facilitate engagement with the representative government rather than the government, the military junta. So I suppose all of this is just to suggest that, yes, I think Morten makes a very important point, that we need to be talking about engagement with other actors. And I'm not really convinced personally that the international community is really engaging very much with the Aung San Suu Kyi being imprisoned. This has all kind of been superseded by other events in the global media. It's not even a topic of discussion anymore, the fact that she is under house arrest. So yes, for sure, different stakeholders. Regarding the point about refugees, again, Morten, I think a very insightful points there in terms of how this isn't just a crisis of criminality, of politics. There's a refugee crisis going on as well. I don't feel as perhaps encouraged by kind of efforts around this, because unfortunately Myanmar is surrounded by ASEAN states whose sentiments towards refugee law is not particularly encouraging. I know I come from Malaysia, and Malaysia isn't particularly got a good track record in terms of adhering to kind of the human rights standards and obligations that we have regarding refugees. So I'm not sure who then would be possibly the ones to help with this refugee crisis. It certainly doesn't seem to me that it's something Western governments are particularly interested in. And I think here we see the kind of repetition of, events happening far away in the West obviously don't garner enough action and solidarity compared to, say, refugees in Europe. I'm also concerned that sometimes when there are kind of efforts around repatriation and resettling of refugees, these are also short-term solutions, right? It is about just giving them, of course, very important, a safe place to stay, but that also then creates its own problem insofar as domestic populations then, or domestic political parties often use this arrival of immigrants, arrival of refugees to further other political agendas that are, unfortunately, we have seen quite xenophobic and racist as well. So I don't know, I think that the engagement is fraught with complexities. But I did wonder, Morten, about your point, if I could just ask a question as well to Morten. Very interesting, your comments about engagement. And I liked how you said that you feel that there needs to be more engagement on the ground. And I wondered whether you felt this might include perhaps more militaristic intervention, because there is a limit to all the dialogue and the mediation and, the kind of solidarity that limits to what that does in terms of actually removing the generals in power. So I wondered what you personally thought about, sort of military engagement, humanitarian intervention, perhaps under the auspices of R2P, which interestingly is very rarely mentioned, at least in the UN with regards to Myanmar. I'll stop here now. Sorry, I've been going on for a bit.
Well, I mean, I think if we could just look at the Myanmar military in isolation, then I think military intervention is worth discussing. But, and I hurry to say this, we can't. Myanmar sits on the border of China, and that basically rules out any kind of military intervention. As far as I'm concerned, it even rules out certainly legal assistance or any assistance for the resistance in the current situation, right? Because China is watching this very, very carefully. And they will not accept any kind of Western-led intervention of a military nature. We would run an enormous risk of provoking some kind of proxy conflict between two ultimately superpowers, right, or great powers. So while tempting, to my mind, military intervention is out of the question. Not just because no Western government is going to do it, or any other government for that matter, but also because I think it would pose enormous risk to Myanmar and to the Myanmar people.
Thank you, Morten, and thank you, Suwita. That's really very interesting, and those sort of international dimensions are probably a good point at which we might close because we're coming close to the end of our allotted time. But I'm going to throw in a bit of a wild card, if I may, and go back from possible solutions now to history. I think Nicholas, viewers of this discussion might find your telling of your discussions with General Min Aung Hlaing, forgive my pronunciation. I think they'll find that very interesting. But you've, of course, at that time, Aung San Suu Kyi was state councillor, and she kind of fell from grace internationally because of the Rohingya crisis. You've argued, I think, quite strongly that she has been unfairly held responsible for those Rohingya mass removals and not turning out to be the human rights icon that many thought she was. Are you able to expand on that briefly for us?
Well, yes. I mean, my constitution makes it very clear. I mean, all the coercive power of the state in Myanmar is in the hands of the commander-in-chief. I mean, he controls the armed forces. He personally appoints the three ministers, the Minister for Defense, the Minister for Border Affairs, and the Minister for Home Affairs. And within Home Affairs comes the police and the prison service. So every firearm which is in the possession of the government of Myanmar comes under the commander-in-chief, and there's no doubt that he, rather than Aung San Suu Kyi, or them together, and the two didn't collude on this matter. It was the commander-in-chief who needs to be held accountable for what's happened to the Rohingya people. With Aung San Suu Kyi, and yet she's the one who the rest of the world has criticized, and partly that's because she is the only Myanmar person that the world knows. You mentioned the name Min Aung Hlaing, and you wouldn't be the only one having difficulty pronouncing his name. But Aung San Suu Kyi, school children learn about it, certainly in Australia, about her. So when something happened and people saw or understood that she'd been elected and that she was the state councillor, and believing that Myanmar had turned to a full democracy, that she certainly must be held responsible. But at best, it's a diarchy. It's a shared power arrangement under the constitution in Myanmar, and an understanding of that, I think, would take her off the hook in terms of responsibility for what had happened. But she then decided to defend the military and her country in The Hague. And that's another matter. So it's an after the event responsibility, if you like, and she has to be responsible for her actions there in that regard. I don't know what was going on in her mind. I haven't didn't speak to her about it, but I would suspect it was a position she took, one, because she feared the military, and I have personal experience of her having a fear of the military. I mean, after the elections in 2015, I would say, based on my conversations with her, had a deep fear that the military would not allow her to assume any office, and that the election result would not be upheld. And I think that fear of the military ran throughout her administration. And so her actions, and again, this is not to say it justifies it, but simply to explain it, perhaps. I think she had that fear, and that some defense of the military and the military's actions in The Hague might buy her the time, but also it's a political act on her part. I think the point has been made that the people of Myanmar were not outraged by what happened to the Rohingya community, and indeed were, I think, perhaps not voicing popular support for it, but there was certainly passive support for it, including amongst religious leaders in Myanmar. And I think Aung San Suu Kyi probably calculated that it would be a popular measure in the upcoming elections for 2020 to defend her country, to stand up for Myanmar internationally. That it's at the expense of the Rohingya, I don't think hurt her reputation within Myanmar. So there might have been a political calculation there as well. And but it does point to the difficulty of a negotiated settlement. I think Morten made the point about engagement with is creating some new opportunities, and I would agree with that. I think we have seen, out of necessity perhaps, rather than out of any conviction, the National Unity Government and the resistance forces reaching out and embracing, to an extent, the Rohingya community and what happened to them. I mean, perhaps a brotherhood of, we're all victims of the military. But that perhaps is the most positive thing that's happened in looking forward in terms of some accommodation of the Rohingya back within the territory of Myanmar, if it is sustained and not just an opportunistic expression to win support from the international community. A belated admission that, yes, well, we should have cared about them. But if that can be, that opening, if you like, can be relied upon or leaned on, to get those in the resistance movement to come to see that the Rohingya people also have rights and also are victims of the military, and that needs to be addressed. If that is becomes a precondition or a condition of greater international interest in their situation and providing assistance, I think that might be the best news for the Rohingya. It's not good news. It's a hope. It's a bit tantalizing, but it's more than what we've seen before. That's the best that can be said.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. I think that's probably a very good point at which to close our discussion. And could I just thank you all very sincerely for participating. We really, really appreciate it. It's a bit of a first for us at the Institute for Continuing History, and we're very grateful to you all. Could I just make a couple of other acknowledgements? I want to record my thanks to Andrew Self for his assistance in the run-up to today. He, of course, bears no responsibility whatsoever for the questions I've asked, but I've had some very useful discussions with him. And thanks to John Wellesby for the technical support that he's provided. I couldn't have got through without it. So to the broader audience, please continue to follow ICH on your YouTube channel or on our website, where you'll find an opportunity to donate to our work if you wish. So thank you all again, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.